Welcome, Chris, to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm so delighted to have you on this week's episode because we've been talking about this for a long time, and finally we get to chat. Do you want to tell listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Hi, Aoife. Delighted to be here. As always, great to talk to you. So, bit of background on me. I'm based in Ireland, but I'm originally from the UK. I've been here for about 17 years. The majority of my working career was spent in technology consulting, and it kind of was the seeds for where I am now in relation to what I do with UnPlug, because during that time, I was all about big data analytics and very much an early adopter of technology. I still am a huge fan of technology. But what happened was I was probably the first one in the office to be always on. This was a long time ago, which initially had some really positive impacts for me. I was able to check in and kind of be reassured that everything was going well and always react to clients and things like that, which is so important. But over time, it developed into a habit of literally I was online 24/7, and it started to have a very major impact on my own well-being, and my productivity suffered. So unrelated to that, I actually changed sector around 2010. I moved over to the not-for-profit sector, in which I worked for about 4 years. And during that time, one of my projects was working in India for nearly 2 years with the sanitation charity WaterAid. Now, that was a spectacularly interesting and impactful, and I feel very privileged to have been part of that team. But the really interesting thing for me now with that was it was almost as if I had this socially controlled experiment, because I'd been in a world of full on tech, loving every shiny new thing, checking every shiny new thing. And then I was in rural India with very little. This was 2012 when there was very little data in rural India. So I had almost gone the complete opposite. And I noticed a massive change in my own behavior. And then when I came back to Ireland, I really saw a huge change in the way even my family were behaving. I remember in my own behavior, I came back and it was my mum's 70th. And as opposed to being there for my mum, most of me was wanting to check my Facebook feed because I hadn't been on Facebook for a couple of months. It was incredible. So I started to become curious about the science. I started to work with a team which now includes people with a background in psychology and neuroscience, and just build on the research that shows us if we make some small changes in how we use technology, we can have some really positive impacts on our behavior and on our well-being and our productivity. So that was 2015 when we set the company up. We're now in more than 70 organizations. I teach regularly at the Digital Wellness Institute, but it's something as far as how technology impacts our behavior. It's something that's only really become relevant, and the lexicons such as always on and digital well-being have only really happened and become mainstream since lockdown, because all of a sudden, we're there thinking, well, this is great. I can work from home. I know McKinsey and company called it the quickening at the beginning of lockdown because it worked and it was amazing. And we were all able to work. But then towards the end of last year, we started just to feel that strain. And I know Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, was quoted as saying, working from home feels a little bit like sleeping at work. And it did. Yeah. And that's where we're helping people now, helping people to maintain that ability to have high focus, high ability to perform while still having good quality disconnection time. So yeah, other than that, I'm now an Irish citizen. So I became an Irish citizen in the last year, which I'm delighted about. In my pastime, I do crazy hardcore activities like jigsaws. I have a very, let's say, mindful practice. I do a lot of yoga and meditation. I do a lot of big pursuits in the mountains, and having spent about 5 years living in developing countries, I love travel, and I'm really excited to be getting back into that. So yeah, that's me.
I think that's why we get along so well, Chris. The interest in travel, the jigsaws, which I only found out about this morning before we started recording. And just, I suppose, this curiosity, interest in data, all of these things. I mean, you've touched on a lot of points already. And I was thinking just this morning, and I'm sure we've had this conversation in the past in one of our many chats, but I live by myself. So I was picking up my phone this morning, and I think it was out of sense of feeling connection. Like, how can I connect with people? And you automatically go to pick up your phone. Like, that's a way of connecting with people, especially if you live on your own. And definitely that has been impacted by lockdown. And, it's been a really, really tough situation. And I suppose, like, where do we start? There is this always on culture. So if people are finding that they're, like, one of the things that you said, it's the reaction to clients, and I'm so aware of that. And I know when I worked in corporate, I would have I don't have my email, my work email is not on my phone anymore. It's not on my phone. I only have access to my work email through my laptop. That's a deliberate choice on my part. But I know certainly when I worked in corporate and we were all given phones so that we're accessible on phone, but we can also check our emails when we got smartphones, you know, kind of in the later years. I'm showing my age now by saying I'm sure I had a non-smartphone for work purposes. But being able to check your emails on your phone was kind of a game changer. But I suppose it's getting my head around all of that. Like, where do we start?
Yeah, and I guess it was always been the promise of technology, right? A lot of the initial adverts, even I have a Remington typewriter advert where it literally says, we'll give you time back in your day. And it was that whole idea of it was supposed to give us time back, but it's really down to how we use it, because quite a lot of the time we find that things pull us back in. So you gave a very personal example there in relation to that feeling of connection. And it just reminded me of how we met, Aoife, because we met through that wonderful master's at DCU. When I did my dissertation there, I'm sure you're familiar, it was around loneliness in the workplace. Yeah. And because it was something that I've struggled with myself, you know, I live on my own, I'm a non-national. And although it's very exotic going off and doing all these wonderful projects overseas, the more you do that, the harder it is to integrate back, because you're kind of, it's almost like a regulatory loop. You're having to start from scratch and people have moved on. But one thing I really recognized in that was, you know, and in the research was that relationship between loneliness and technology. And I was actually on a masterclass this morning where we were talking about that paradox of technology and how the triggers of notifications pull us in. But what people were starting to talk about was the internal triggers as well, which is something we often don't talk about because it's a far harder conversation. So in a work context, it might be, well, there's a bit of paranoia or anxiety that I need to always be checking in because, you know, that client might call or my boss might contact me. Whereas the reality is, it's very rare it actually happens. But we've never had a conversation with our colleagues saying, do you know what, just if something bad happens, text me at the weekends. Because if we did that, we wouldn't be checking our email so much. Whereas because we've never had that shared values and norms discussion, we check all the platforms, right? It's incredible. So yeah, that's one of the various ways that it pulls us in. But I think it's something that in the world of lockdown, so many positives from technology, you know, that whole thing of, for those people who had children, it was clearly good for their education, and maybe just to have as a distraction. And, you know, as a non-national, and for you, I'm sure you have family down the country, just keeping in contact and being able to cope. But then there was that balance because, you know, if we think of Tiger King at the beginning, one episode was good, 2 or 3 episodes, feeling like we've gone into that bad zone. And it's the same with work, you know, it's great that we could do this, but at the same time, you know, the studies out of Harvard and multiple studies have shown that working time went up by around 30%, which a lot of us initially anecdotally were thinking, well, you know, I don't have to commute, I don't have all these little things, so I can squeeze in a bit of extra work. And productivity cumulatively has not gone up. So overall, with our working hours going up, that means that productivity has really come down, which isn't a positive thing. And a lot of that is because we're not necessarily in control of our technology. And it doesn't mean it's going off and doing something crazy. What it means is, you know, we're not aware as to the values that we share with our colleagues. Another example, and I'm going to be really cheeky here, Aoife, because I love your podcast, and number 81 about boundaries, I loved, but I'm going to challenge you on one thing you said.
Yes, please.
Because when it comes to reciprocity, you said, which a lot of people do, you know, it's really important when you send an email out of office hours to have something saying, listen, I don't expect a reply. But we have to remember that the internet and email is systemic, right? So when that goes out, if somebody doesn't have the same boundaries as you, they might still check their email, even if it says that. It's developing that habit. And then if we think of the neurotransmitters they're getting from that, so that lovely feeling of dopamine, of new information, if it's maybe a deeper connection, if it's a partner, it's oxytocin or whatever it might be. And these are all developing very deep internal triggers. So ideally what we have in that situation is, because I'm the same, I work different hours and I have colleagues I work with that I teach with at the Digital Wellness Institute in the US, and I have colleagues that I'm now working with in India, really big time differences. But I always make sure for all those colleagues that, you know, it goes at a certain time, you know, it's not interrupting them in the middle of the night, which is a really hard thing to do. But also back to that fact of, we've never sat down and gone, do you know what, Aoife, What's the platform? If something goes wrong in this project that I can contact you with, we can't make an assumption, because for some people it might be WhatsApp, some people it might be text, some people it might be, might be Slack or Teams. But what people are doing is they're checking everything all of the time. So that ability to actually disconnect, and by disconnect, I don't mean running off to the mountains and becoming a hippie, which is fantastic, but I mean actually the ability to psychologically detach. That concept, that construct from Sabine Sonnentag and her team at Mannheim University, the idea that when we detach from work properly, we can come back so much stronger. And the science has shown us again and again with psychological detachment that when we do that properly, when we have clearly defined downtime, then we're able to improve our productivity, improve our ability to switch off and sleep, and improve our relationship with other humans. And quite often what happens there's a book I'm reading at the moment by Bridget Shelter, and it's around being busy, and there's a concept she refers to called time confetti, because quite often what happens is when we have that downtime, we'll sit down and we'll be like, okay, I've got 1 hour of downtime, this is magical, I'm going to sit down, I might watch an episode of something, or I might have a conversation with someone special in my life. But because we've got that habit of continuously checking, we might check our Twitter, we might check our LinkedIn, we might just check email because something might happen. And what that's doing is it might only be 6 minutes over an hour, but it's fragmenting it. So it means we're never getting quality rest. So in the middle of the night, when our brain's going, okay, I'm shutting down. Oh, I'm expecting dopamine. Oh, I'm expecting oxytocin. So we can never really recharge. So it's a complicated thing because everyone has different habits. Everyone has different situations that they live in, where there are other distractions. There was somebody on a call this morning who was talking about their internal trigger is guilt when the dishwasher beeps, right? So it brings it even more complicated when we're at home. But
Chris, you have covered so much there, and there's loads I would love to unpack. The first thing I want to say is Tiger King. Do you know what? I feel like I'm the only person in the world, but I never watched it. I never watched Tiger King. And I'm like, is it worth it? When you get to the end, would you say, is it worth me watching Tiger King? I don't know.
I mean, it's one of those things you have to go in it with a mindset of, okay, this is just going to be popcorn for the brain.
Okay.
And I think I almost, it was one of those things that was really important to me to have as a check-in conversation at the beginning of conversations with people, because we weren't doing anything at the beginning of lockdown. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like, oh, where'd you go at the weekend? I went to my spare room.
Tiger King.
So it was nice to have something. It's pure trash TV, but at the same time, culturally really, really interesting. I used to work in an animal sanctuary in Bolivia. So I have a fascination with big cats because I used to work with pumas there and ocelots. So, I wanted to see what was going on. I was totally unaware of that animal trade in the US and other related trades as well. So I found it fascinating. But I mean, it's not the best use of your time. And if you're going to do it, do make sure you've got your autoplay switched off, because otherwise you'll just watch the whole lot.
Oh, right. Okay.
Trash TV, right? You just go more and more and more and more.
So easy, easy to do. The other thing, you're just as you were speaking about that whole boundaries thing, I realized, I was like, yes, it's about putting on those time delays. It's, and making use of those things so that people don't check. So it's sending out a message of, I'm available at this time, but actually putting yourself in the other person's shoes and saying, well, when is that person available? But still also saying that you're not expecting an immediate response, and they may be working at different hours as well.
And that
so
conversation, is so important, Aoife, just having that conversation, because we don't know, and especially now behind a screen, we can't see when somebody's resources are completely gone. We can't see when they're exhausted. We can't see when they're leaning against a wall and holding a cup of coffee, shaking because, they've had a heavy weekend, there's been a family trauma or whatever it might be. We could kind of see that in the office. So you need to have shared values and norms. And I think this is, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but for me, it's the difference between what I would call flexible working arrangements, where you're just kind of saying, well, we're doing this thing, a Zoom free Friday, or we have emails that have a notification at the bottom saying, don't expect to reply if it's the weekend, etc. It's the difference between that, which flexible working arrangements have been really, really positive, especially in relation to employer branding, these meeting-free Wednesdays, Zoom-free Fridays, etc. That and what the likes of you and I would have worked with in our masters around work design, where it's more strategic, where you're looking to do things like actually sit down and discuss, firstly, why are we doing this? Because for some people, if you have, for example, if you're using Teams and you have a do not disturb button on, people might just be thinking, is Chris just down the chipper? Or is he, what's he doing? Whereas if you have on do not disturb, well, actually, I'm working on a project for client X and I need to have focus. Otherwise, I won't get this done. And explain the why of that as far as, have a chat about psychological detachment and task switching and all these things, put it in funny terms that are rewarding. So one of our keynotes, basically. But, having that education so people understand the why, making sure it's coming in from the top so leaders are taking it on board. And then just making sure it's an ongoing process. So, using the skills like you would have around analytics to have, whether it's check-ins or KPIs, actually making sure that it's working. Because right now, the biggest learning we have, the first lockdown taught us that, I'm being a bit of a hippie here, but that kind of Osho learning of impermanence, right? Now what we're discovering is, we're kind of assuming we're going to go back to hybrid and it's going to work. This is even wider as far as the options we now have. There is so much fluidity here. There is so much a complex nature of what we're doing. So we have to be fluid. We have to be iterative and agile in everything we're doing. But also, as opposed to just going, right, we're just going to have Zoom-free Fridays and assume it's going to work. We need to educate people why. We need to lead by example and really then check in as to see how it's working.
I mean, again, so much to cover. I want to quickly go back to this idea of working time going up by 30%, but productivity hasn't gone up. That in itself, I think, is hugely interesting because we think that we're being more productive by being more busy, but actually we're not. And to me, that comes back down to exactly what you're talking about. Why are we here? What are we doing? What are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve here? And filling our time with busy work because we're getting that stimulation, we're getting that sense of accomplishment or achievement or recognition or whatever it might be, or the badge of honor of being busy as well, so all of those things. So it's really, really interesting that hasn't gone up. This idea of not being in control of our technology. Gretchen Rubin, who talks about happiness and habits a lot. She has this thing where it's let technology be it's a master versus don't let technology be your master. Like you are in control of technology as opposed to being at its behest, essentially. So it's so interesting. The idea of flexible working arrangements, I have been reading a lot about this. And for me, I suppose it's the difference between flexible working arrangements and reduced hours. And I can see the huge benefits of reduced hours. And that goes into this idea of design, coming back to purpose, coming back to why is it that we are doing what we're doing. But with flexible hours, there's still the option for people who need that extra level of flexibility taking advantage or not taking advantage because of the perception, because they're not as committed to work as other people, they're going to earn less money, all of these different things. Like we had flexible working options when I worked in corporate, and it always shocked me that people wouldn't take advantage of them. And I was the one, it was like I would happily take an extra 5 or 10 days holidays and take a salary cut. That is absolutely fine for me. And I was so shocked that other people didn't see that. Like for me, I valued the additional time more than I valued the additional money. This idea as well of assuming that things are going to work. So the big struggle that I see with moving towards hybrid is people haven't got a clue what it is that they want to do. They don't know what's going to work, but they're not asking people about what will work. I don't know what the blocker is there. Is it that, do they feel that by asking, they're showing a level of vulnerability that they have no idea what they're doing?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm seeing more of now is people doing that. I think at the beginning of lockdown, I remember speaking to a couple of CTOs and CIOs who were like, this is great, it's working. I think we should be working from home forever. And I was like, okay, so can you just describe your environment to me? And they're like, well, I'm in this big detached house with my own office and my kids have a nanny, and then not thinking about the graduates who, just started a job, might be 6 of them around a kitchen table. And more importantly than that, the connection that those graduates have and how they actually develop their career. That career development really doesn't happen when we're remote working. That's the, Nick Bloom, again, out of Stanford, his big outtake as far as virtual teams, which is what we called remote workers before, was you don't have career development. So I think I'm seeing a lot more now. There are organizations who are asking, a number of different stakeholders. But yeah, it's a really complicated science, but flexibility is key. So long as we're aware that, look, we've been through this, we know we want to have the flexibility, but the amount of people I'm seeing now, and I'm really happy about this because my personal area of research is still very much around loneliness and connection, is I'd say probably for me, 9 out of 10 people are saying, I am so excited to be back in the office with my colleagues. But the caveat with that is we're not back to normal. So we have no benchmark. We can't say, well, we're back in the office, because we're not really, because we're back in the office, but people are wearing masks, they're social distancing. We're not having the liminal moments where we're sitting down and having a cup of tea together. So we can't relate it. There's no studies that have been based on that, right? Because this is so new. So I think that's where I'm seeing actually the kind of the 1 out of 10 people saying, oh no, I don't like being back in the office. It's weird, social distancing. And I'm like, this is why, back to what you were saying there, we need to keep that agile, iterative, flexible approach, because it's going to be a learning, and we don't know what the next 6 months holds. We like to think that restrictions will start to loosen a little bit and we'll be back in the office. But I was actually speaking at a live event yesterday with about 70 people, and a lot of them had never met. It was a really fantastic, innovative event, but just hearing their conversations, it was all about connection. And then back to that idea of having fun, the liminal moments of, you don't get that on Zoom or Teams unless you try and prescribe it when it's very hard. We used to have, even if we had back-to-back meetings, we would have 10 seconds where we looked across. So when I'd be in lectures with you, first couple of lectures, no one knew each other. And after a while, for you were always the one who had the most questions. And I loved that, right? So I'd always give you a nod. I was like, oh, I'm just going to have a good one here. Right. And, it's that little thing of, when I'd see you, then after, knowing you for a couple of months, even if it was just a smile, that is magical, right? It's such a powerful thing. And I don't want to get too bells and smells, but it's almost thinking of that, the connection over efficiency, and how can we make sure we are maintaining that? It's really hard to do if we're all going to be remote all the time. But yeah, I am seeing those decisions start to be more kind of organization wide and taking in all opinions, which is really, really good.
Yeah. No, we could probably talk for hours. And I suppose I want to bring it back to where we started. And I know you said there's no kind of one size fits all solution. But maybe having to think about like the first step towards psychological detachment from being always connected. What are some of the common things that come up for people, or as a takeaway from listening today, what can someone actively do today to stop that? Of course, the irony being that they're likely listening to this podcast using technology on their phones.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. Back to what you're saying earlier in relation to us being the master of technology, because there's so much good stuff there. I guess there's a number of different ways of looking at that. If we look at kind of the wider guardrails that are out there, we have a really good legislation here in Ireland now around the right to disconnect, which in a number of other geographical jurisdictions, it's been a lot harder. It's actually been in law, and that really encourages out of office emails to be the exception rather than the norm. Whereas here in Ireland, it's basically a loose legislation, whereas you take what the Workplace Relations Commission have done, and you can design your own guidelines for your organization. And what we're working on with a lot of organizations is to build in team charters and communication charters around that. Because if it's too hard, then it doesn't take into consideration what you were saying there, as far as we all use technology differently. Some of us work flexible hours. Some of us have geographical teams that are dispersed over different time zones. So we need to take these factors into place, which is really hard when it's one size fits all. But that is something that, again, it's raising awareness. People are like, well, what is the right to disconnect? And we're finding, it's interesting because the Queen announced the employment bill in her New Year's speech this year in the UK, which I don't listen to the Queen's speeches, but I actually listened to that one because I was like, wow, she can talk about the right to disconnect. This is good. I could use this as a video. But she mentioned the employment bill that's going to come out in December. So I think in the UK, that's going to be it's going to be in a lot of the media. So it will raise the discussion around how can we help our staff to disconnect. So I think there's two things there when it actually comes to us as individuals. One is in relation to the culture of the organization. And as you were talking about earlier, that work design, how can we do this? How can we raise awareness of the importance of disconnecting and moving away from the performance of culture more to the performance of resilience and recharging? So the likes of Sean Aker, the happiness psychologist, and Michelle Gillen out of Harvard, they talk a lot about that, that performance is, we can push ahead, but sometimes we really need to step back and look after ourselves. And then just kind of individual habits. So doing things at home where we're really being aware of boundaries. Probably the most simple one is, this is an individual thing. So it's finding out, where you are almost using technology too much at home. But the most simple one would be something like the bedroom, where so many of us use our phone as our alarm clock. And the irony is they're really good alarm clocks, right? Because they might wake us up with a sound we want to hear, or our favorite music, or whatever it might be. But at the same time, if we have them there, then we're potentially creating a bit of a challenge for our brains to actually switch off. And there's a number of reasons it's doing that. First, if we have the habit of task switching, if it's really close to us, then it's going to be something that our brain is just expecting dopamine or whatever neurotransmitter it might be used to getting from that. And to build on that, a study which I refer to a number of times is the iPhone effect, which basically shows us if we have a digital device in our line of sight, even if it's switched off and turned over, it impacts our IQ and our empathy. And it's that whole thing of, if it's just there, then we might not be consciously thinking of it, but subconsciously our brain's going to be going, TikTok, email, Tinder. Which means it's really hard for us to sleep. So, the bedroom would be a good place to start, because the bedroom is really important for sleep and for intimacy, not necessarily for angry birds. But it's that whole thing of, how can I create behavior change here? You know how this works. It's really hard when it's something that has some pluses as well, because audiobooks and alarm clocks are really good on our phones. So it's the idea of, first of all, doing it small, starting BJ Fogg, the kind of tiny habits, but also being kind to ourselves and looking to reward ourselves. So if we're going to take that out, what are we going to replace it with? It might be a voice assist, which doesn't have the same triggers. It might be an alarm watch that has a vibrating alarm, or it might be something like the alarms that have the lights that come up. But it's trying to do something that where we're rewarding ourselves and we're creating the boundaries. And over time, that means we have less of a relationship to that task switching, to that continuous trigger of our brain expecting the likes of dopamine. But it's a very individual, subjective science, right? We need to find out what our triggers are internally, externally, and then model them and see, okay, where is this impacting me the most? How can I change that?
To me, it comes back to one of the most crucial parts of leadership, and that's awareness. Like, it's having that self-awareness, and even leading yourself through self-awareness, and just being aware of, exactly as you said, Chris, what those triggers are. We've covered an awful lot of ground today. I will summarize a lot of the points. There's so much I'd love to dive into a little bit more detail, but I'm just conscious of time here today. And I suppose for me, like, if people want to connect with you, if they want to reach out to you, or before we even get to that, what makes you happier at work, Chris? The question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast.
What makes me happy at work? One thing that's changed in the last couple of months is humans. I'm able to be in a room with other humans. I really, I think I'm the same as you, Aoife. I thrive in a room with other humans, and it's been amazing. I've been very fortunate to be able to continue working using these great platforms like Zoom and Teams, but it's not the same, when you have that lovely interaction, and then when you can actually see change and you can see people making notes and they come up to you afterwards and they're like, I love that part. That's how I'm going to improve my focus. And then that's the other big thing for me, actually having impact and, going deeper. So keynotes, moving on from masterclasses, really looking at individual habits, working them through, coming back, having reflection sessions, and then moving into digital culture. But at the same time, because like you, we're a small organization, remembering to have fun and take downtime as well. Because, the last 18 months have been hard for us. We've had work, but at the same time, rates have come down, all this kind of thing. So it's been that whole thing of, taking a step back and actually enjoying the process and having a bit of fun with it. So I always make sure I do a morning dance. I do some crazy things in the morning. I have a nice bath every morning and do a morning dance and a morning song, all those things. So,
Nice morning routine habits going on.
Yeah.
And if people want to connect with you, Chris, if they want to find out more about what you do, what is the best way they can do that?
Yeah, I was just because I was talking about loneliness before. When you say connect, I like hugs. But if they wanted to, want to do it in a more
find
formal,
you wearing a sign saying free hugs.
That's yeah. If they want to do it in more of a, let's say, a business sense, because I know hugging is not for everyone. Yeah, we're at unplughq.com. We also have a new offering. We're working with the award-winning consultancy Row Remote, so Rowena Hennington and her team, around a right to disconnect operational plan, and we're offering free audits for people. So if you go to write2, the numeric 2, disconnect.com, you can find out about that there. So it's unplughq.com is us, and then our new Right to Disconnect project is write2 numeric disconnect.com.
Incredible. That's brilliant. Thank you so much for your time on the podcast today, Chris. I absolutely loved chatting with you, as I always do. So thank you for being one of my guests.
Yay. Thanks for the chat, Aoife. I loved it.